sacks to suffocate, the female chicks bred to deformity, the way that pregnant sows are confined in gestation crates so that they can't nurse their newborns, the way the dairy cows are forcibly inseminated. It is sometimes called a rape rack. And their male calves are taken from them 24 hours after birth and confined in crates, where they will be fed an iron-deprived diet until they are slaughtered at 3 months of age for a veal. They're auctioned off still wet with the umbilical cord still hanging. This is babies. Okay, so bridging affect theory and feminist animal studies, Lori Gruen proposes the concept of entangled empathy as a strategy for reminding humans of our interactions across species and food production systems. This species injustice that we see is, I'm arguing, a failure of reproductive justice for the animals so confined. It is a failure of environmental justice for the workers, for the environments that are polluted, the manure piles, the water, and, of course, human health. So let's go on to how it affects climate change. Carol Adams has spent a lot of time arguing for the association between beef and masculinity, and the idea that real men eat beef. And I don't know if you saw the ad for Burger King, Burger King's Manthem, which shows men throwing over chick food, which is quiche and salad, and going out into the streets demanding Whoppers. And with the Whopper, they're able to push over trucks and follow a scantily clad blonde white woman who has a shovel out and is holding another large hamburger at the tip of the shovel to get a very strong man to pull a tractor with all the other men in it. And so it's this big male bonding thing over meat. So why is that a problem? Well, other than the masculinity part is a problem, it's also a problem with climate justice. So the United Nations report, Livestock's Long Shadow, has found that meat production accounts for 1/5 of greenhouse gas emissions, more than transport. And it's because cows emit methane, which is 23 times more dangerous. And it's also because when we have meat production like this, we're losing forest. So we're losing the capacity to absorb that. And they argue that giving up 176 pounds of meat per year, which is, if you're an omnivore in the US, eating a first world diet, that's what you're consuming, is 176 pounds of meat per year, is actually one of the greenest lifestyle changes you can make. Paul Watson of Sea Shepherd has said that no one who calls himself or herself an environmentalist can have a meat-based diet. Being a vegetarian and being an environmentalist go hand in hand, because it's a practice. It's a practice. It's enacting our values and aligning them up. From the Scientific American, there's a correlation between what it means to eat this food and how that compares to how far you might have driven, what your carbon dioxide or global greenhouse gas emissions would be. And as you can see, eating potatoes is lowest, apples, asparagus, and then chicken bumps you a bit farther, eating pigs quite a bit farther, and eating beef the farthest of all. I also want to talk about obesity in first world overconsumers and restore the other half, which is the 2/3 world, people suffering from hunger and malnourishment. These can be correlated with rates of animal food consumption and with the gendered character of hunger. Around the world, it is women who are responsible for cooking and serving food. It is men who eat the first and most nutritious foods, leaving children to eat afterwards and women to eat last. When there is insufficient food, women deny themselves food so that children can eat. How many women or girls in here remember your mother telling you, take the smallest piece? If there's a piece that's crumbled or not as pretty, that's the one you take. You don't have to raise your hands. I know you're there. Okay. An estimated 146 million children in developing countries are underweight due to acute or chronic malnutrition. 60% of the world's hungriest are women, According to the World Food Program, if women farmers had the same access to resources, which is funding and support and tools and being given good soil to farm on, the number of hungry people in the world would be reduced by up to 150 million. I believe that world hunger really means, when we're talking about world hunger, we're talking about children. You might remember this photograph. It was taken by a Nobel Prize-winning photographer who saw this child crawling to a UN feeding station. Behind the child, a vulture is waiting for the child to die so that the vulture can eat the child. What should I say here? The photographer is Kevin Carter. No one knows if the child reached the center, and 3 months later, Kevin Carter committed suicide because the facts were just too grim for him to bear. So here's what we're looking at. 13 pounds of grain and 2,400 gallons of water yield 1 pound of meat. What else could you do with that grain to feed people? Meat uses 11 times as many fossil fuels to produce a calorie of animal protein. Raising animals for food requires 30% of the Earth's surface, and as hunger activists have been telling us for decades, there is enough food to feed everyone. Yet over 900 million people are hungry. Why? So, and yet in this situation, of course, it's predicted that meat is increasing. And there are films you can get now that show China is, their favorite meat is pork. So there's now factory farming for pork that's being brought there because people want to emulate the first world diet. We're seen as successful, and we're successful because we eat animals. That's what is being heard around the world. So this is going to be increasing exponentially. For too long, food justice has been defined solely in terms of justice across human diversity, communities of color, poor communities, community gardens. And that's true. But authentic food justice cannot be practiced while simultaneously excluding those who are the food. Food justice requires interspecies justice. And this intersects with reproductive justice, artificial insemination. It also intersects with queer justice alike. There is a queer food justice movement. Aren't you thrilled? I know you are. And it grows out of a loose-knit, decentralized group of social activists challenging dominant discourses of sexuality, gender, and nature. A few groups: Queer Food for Love, the Rainbow Chard Alliance. There's queer food justice movement in groups from Vermont, Massachusetts, and Connecticut to Tennessee, Alabama, Arkansas, Kansas, and Washington. This is Queer Food for Love in drag at a party. There are little examples of who they're pretending to be. And there is a queer vegan food cookbook that is put out. So there is this movement underneath all of this. So, with these facts of world hunger, food production, gender, sexuality, and species restored to climate change, charging human overpopulation as a root cause of climate change is misguided. Climate change may be described as white hetero-male supremacy on steroids, boosted by widespread injustices of gender, age, and race, sexuality, and species. Eating high on the food chain must be seen as tilting the planet's plate of food into the mouths of the world's most affluent at a cost of between 870 million people, half of them children under the age of 5, who suffer from chronic undernourishment. So what do we want? Here are the Bali Principles of Climate Justice, formulated in 2002. They do restore some of the story to what we need, and they can be improved. Principle 1 affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species. But it is not yet informed by a post-humanist perspective. Just as it affirms the need for solutions that address women's rights, it could affirm queer rights. Just as it is opposed to the commodification of nature and its resources, it could oppose the commodification of animal bodies and female bodies across species. So, in November 2013, that's just last November, a workshop on gender balance and gender equity was held at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Council of the Parties in Warsaw. And they argued once again, how many years later would this be? 1991, 2013, 22 years later, that we should have gender equity. And this time, it took. So the promise is that for 2014, there's going to be gender equity. And in all of the climate change discussions, stay tuned, I would say, for that. But, being a skeptic, I have to ask, does bringing women forward actually solve the problem? We flip sides. So there have been some studies on gender differences in climate change knowledge, attitudes, and actions. And a number of studies show that women are more active in environmental reform projects. Women make between 60 and 80% of the people in grassroots environmental organizations. Women perceive climate change as more threatening. Women in the US actually have scientific knowledge that they don't display, that they underestimate their own knowledge more than men. Men tend to overestimate their knowledge, I don't know if you've noticed this, and women tend to underestimate their knowledge. This is gender. We don't have to do this. Women are more skeptical about the effectiveness of climate change policies, more willing to change to a climate-friendly lifestyle, and yet with all this, women are underrepresented in climate change policy. So I saw this and I said, that can't be right. That seems so cultural feminist. It seems so biased. So I read all the methodology sections in these, and in this paper that I'm working on, I have a long footnote that talks about everyone's methodology, and it's really reliable. These are not, there's this one study for each one of these is citing 93 other studies. So the data collection is huge on this. I looked very hard, I found one exception. Here she is. Connie Hedegaard, name spelled like mine. Commissioner on Climate Action, who was, quote, not in favor of addressing gender in European climate policy because she deemed it relevantly only for developing countries. And she didn't want to be overloaded by integrating gender into considerations. So here you have an elite white woman who sees gender as not relevant. We know that class can buy you out of a lot of oppression. So can race. So here's the caveat. Gender balance at all levels of climate change decision making is necessary but not sufficient, which is what philosophers would say. We need it, and it's not enough. A wider transformation is needed, and it must involve progressive men and genderqueer others who are prepared to question their masculinity and their gender roles and work together to uncover the embedded gender, sexuality, and power relations in climate change policy and mitigation strategies. What about queers? Well, here's the data. Turns out this is a study, a Harris Interactive poll done in 2009, and the study is titled LGBT Americans Think, Act, and Vote More Green. So this is a Harris poll, I think 3,000 people in this study, and these were the questions. Do you support environmental causes? Do you believe that climate change is really happening now? Do you call yourself an environmentalist? Do you see a connection between your environmental values and how you vote, how you buy, or where you work? The lavender ones are the queer. So you can see how the scores go. Why is that? Why would queers be more environmentally friendly than heterosexuals? Well, if you read Suzanne Farr's Homophobia as a Weapon of Sexism, published in 1988 and still a classic, you will see the connection between gender of women and gendering and sexuality. And there's something there. There's something up. People who are marginalized have a different perspective. And that's why feminist ethics say if you want the most inclusive perspective, go to the margins and ask, what does it look like from there? So let's see. Who sits at the table? The heads of delegations have been largely men. They say they're going to change that. So here, what do we want? Gender parity in 2014, that would be great. Shifting talks from economic globalization to economic justice. This was also something that was talked about at World Women's Congress because we got to hear from Marilyn Waring, who I had never met before. And she's an excellent speaker. I don't know if she's still alive. I don't know if anyone knows. So she said what Annie from Story of Stuff said, which is our economic system only counts pollution. So the forest that's giving many animals a home and giving us air to breathe and all that has no economic value until it's clear cut. Then it has economic value. Meaning, since our lives depend on it, there's something wrong with our economic system. And we actually need a transformation. We need an ecological accounting system. And so any sustainability studies program that lacks an ecological economics component to it is only going to do culture change. But everything in this country runs on money. And that's what we have to address. It runs on it globally. Okay? Leave the oil in the soil, you're familiar with that. Sustainable energy, sustainable transit. Van Jones, the green jobs, green for all. Transition town movement, reproductive and queer justice, food justice, species justice. And then here, transforming how we think of ourselves. Looking at white privilege and climate change. I did say that climate change is white privilege on steroids. I didn't have time to unpack that claim. Rethinking masculinity, critical. I'm opposed to doing away with masculinity because many people find it very sexy. So it needs to be rethought. And it's not just about men. Women are masculine too. Queer people are masculine too. So how can we think about an ecological masculinity that's not based on dominance? How can we redefine success? And how could we follow Bolivia and Ecuador in granting equal rights to nature? Thank you. Thank you for staying so long.
Who has questions or comments?
What concrete things have your group done to first talk about women?
The Women's Environment Development Organization has done a lot. They are an international coalition of women in leadership positions in different countries. And the list is long. Mostly it's talking to the United Nations as well as implementing gender equity in different non-governmental organizations, in different aid organizations, bringing a gender perspective to climate change approaches. So it is a long list, but clearly it's not enough because we're in a climate change era. Yeah. And this is the problem, is we always look at women and say, what are women doing? Because we're always used to being the ones who do it, you know, the 80% of the grassroots, that the men are largely the ones in leadership. And until we shake that up, yeah, we're going to be where we are, pretty much. And I really do want to say, just because you have a woman in leadership doesn't mean you can just turn it over and go home. That's absolutely not true. There are plenty of women who are part of the Borg. You know? Yeah.
Hi, I just have a question about a term that was on one of your slides that I didn't understand. The term was the transition town movement, and probably everybody knows about this, but I have no idea what it is. So can you just
I could
briefly
try
say?
and hot link from this. Let's see if it works. Oh, I'm so excited. So this started in England, I think in 2004, 2005, and what transition towns involved is people in your community come together and say, what's the problem? What do we need here? How could we prepare our community for climate change? And so what people are doing is saying, you know, on our block, let's fund a solar collector for our block and then have the energy distributed. Let's do something with our yards and do a larger community garden right here on our block, not even having to go somewhere else, you know? So some of it's thinking the way that the co-housing movement was thinking. So food, energy, health, you know, just getting to know your neighbors. I know it sounds old-fashioned, but economic systems also, the local exchange trading system, which has been around for a very long time, I understand there's one in the Berkshires, Massachusetts, and it's called Berkshires. Berkshires. And so someone has to keep track of this, but what it means is that 1 hour of someone's time, everyone in this room, 1 hour is 1 hour. It's 1 hour, okay? So I need childcare for an hour, and a student in here needs help with their writing. That's it. It's hour for hour. There's no profit. It's barter. And so what that does is, by knowing what are the skills in your community and then sharing them, doing skill sharing, it builds community, because the kind of resilience that we need for climate change is not going to be acquired by hoarding 3 years' supply of wheat and barley or something. Like, how long is that going to work? And then are you going to sit outside with a gun ready to shoot people who are hungry? I'm not.
We don't have any, transition towns on Long Island right now, but there are discussions going on. Actually, I was at a meeting yesterday with a group of people that, through Slow Food and through some other organizations, and all it takes is, some people getting together. So people, Long Island, right, it's a harder place, but it's definitely, it's happening right now.
And the slow food movement, kind of like the food justice movement, they are having partial stories, who's in there. Like, if we think about nationally, the locavore movement, it's white men.
Yeah.
And then there's Will Allen in Milwaukee, right? and that's really not representative. I mean, anyone who's read Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens knows that, wow, black women farming, that's got a long history, and black women gardening in Harlem, rooftop gardens, balcony gardens, fire escape gardens, and that's why the queer food movement has come about, is just feeling uncomfortable in those conversations because you can't bring all of yourself.
I'm just wondering how much your activism intersects with other gender-based activism on a global level that's focused more on traditional political rights. For example, women who are working in constructing these new constitutions and new nations, trying to give women equal rights. The more conservative institutions that are pressing for women's integration into the economy, this kind of women's or gender justice from a political level, for a long time was kind of focused on human rights in a much more substantive kind of giving, resources to women. And now the big thing is women in development, empowering women to be in the market, empowering women through the loans, the
microfinance.
Yeah. But the whole idea is that you solve these inequalities, gender inequalities, by making women entrepreneurs, especially the global South, giving them access to loans. And it seems like that's another one of these where people aren't listening, or where the problem is not being addressed in a way that breaks out of the larger problem. But I don't know, and I don't know whether your groups are in co-conversation with those other groups that are working on more of a political side about empowerment in a more traditional way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like these references to my groups.
Tell us, leader. What are
I don't know who my groups are. I belong to groups, and as always, with like so many of you, I'm sure I belong to 5 groups, because there isn't the one group that gets everything that I want people to get. So unfortunately, I have to go to these 5 groups, and this has been a problem since the 80s. When I thought, well, now first I go to the feminist group, and then they're eating hamburgers. And then I go to the environmental group, and they're selling Playboy for a fundraiser. And it's
always a problem. But it was so resonant. Some of the things you were saying with other movements that are not at all actually focused on the environment, but they're very concerned about women's inequality, economic inequality, but they're stuck in a kind of mindset, mostly coming from the World Bank, coming from the UN, about how the key to addressing that is to get women, WID, women in development, this get them in the market.
Right. You know, there's, I think, Women for Women International, you adopt
Yeah.
a sister in another country, and then, you know, you fund her and that kind of thing. I don't think that there's necessarily a disharmony between, I actually adopted a girl in Thailand and sending money to her, because I'm a first world white woman, and she's not. And so I consider her part of my family, and she considers me part of her family, and the money goes to build infrastructure in the community. And I don't feel too bad about it. And I can still have a more transformative vision. I think that, you know, the people on the margins who say, this is what we need, we need to listen to them. We can have big pictures of what, but if that's what people need, they need it now, you know. I don't think we're prevented from working on more transformative things by helping people in the immediate present. I'm a little troubled by things like heifer, you know, sending them slaves of another species. I'm personally troubled by that. So I don't belong to it. But I don't, you know, go out and picket them or, you know, bomb their shelters like, you know, the anti-abortion guys. I mean, I just don't belong to that. Yeah.
Other questions? Comments? I mean, one of my classes we were just talking, you had put the term anthropocene in your write-up, or it was there, and we were talking about Thomas Berry's Ecozoic era that he was talking about years ago, and some other writers, and I was just wondering if you had a thought on the kind of naming of this epoch that we're moving into right now. So there have been a lot of common people a little bit troubling this.
Well, as it turns out, in 2 weeks from now, we're having a conference in Wisconsin called Anthropocene Feminism.
Yeah.
And it's at the Center for 21st Century Studies. And what can I say? I think the term is helpful because if it hasn't, whatever we can do to wake people up. So like, this is such a powerful era. What's happening right now is so powerful that we're changing the name of history. We're changing the geologic age. Maybe that will wake people up. So that's good. But then I tend to be personally really wary of trendiness in the academy, and actually strongly dislike trendiness in the academy. And you know, in searching for these names, I could say, I thought I came up with the term ecofeminism in 1989. And I went to the National Women's Studies Association. I was on the first panel on ecofeminism, and that's where I met Ariel Sala and Marty Thiel, and Noelle Sturgeon came, and Steffi O'Hara came, and Lori came, and we all thought we'd invented it. No one heard of Francois Diabon. We all, you know, we all thought we'd invented this term. Oh, ecology, feminism, it makes sense, you know. And since then, there have been all these battles over the term, and now the cool thing is material feminism and posthumanism. And posthumanism, you know, it's Carrie Wolf, skip 20 years, and then let's talk about Peter Singer and Tom Regan. It's like, what happened in those 20 years? Feminist animal studies is what happened in those 20 years. 20 years of scholarship not cited in posthumanism, because posthumanism is the trendy thing, but not. And so, you know, I really like anarchists. Some of my best friends are anarchists. And their argument is, get the message out. Use whatever language you need. Get the message out. If your message is co-opted, beautiful. You don't need to be cited. Get the message out. So, yeah, background.
Are you all the way back? I was just wondering, what is the big opposition to getting this message out? Like, how come it is not all over the place? It seems like it is an extremely important issue, but yet we seem to be concerned about other things. Like
You mean
the
climate change?
Kardashians and things like that. Like, why isn't this like front page news? Like,
The issue of climate change?
Yes.
Why isn't it out there? Okay,
Yeah.
so you remember the dream?
Mm-hmm.
Remember the dream? Okay.
Also, it's
All you have to do is look around. I flew in to New York, and I saw a lot of smog. I saw polluted waterways. Nothing was living in that water. And you know what I saw? Stadiums. Hey, come watch the games. That's the news media, corporate news media. People are being distracted. You know, how many people are listening to Democracy Now? And how many people are listening to Fox, WCCO, or whatever the corporate news media is, you know? How many people are reading things on the internet from Al Jazeera? No, because of racism. We don't want to read those Arabs. We don't want to read those people. Because of classism. We don't want to be called commies. Yeah, it's worked. That's why. So we have a really hard communication task. I mean, that's why climate change communication studies, climate change rhetoric should be right up there. You know, and I mean, I'm edging in on it, but I don't have that huge background that someone in rhetoric and communication studies could bring to this. And you know, you think about like Noam Chomsky would be great right now. Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard of the United Nations incentive to give certain countries an allowance of units that allow them to use, like, I don't know, a certain output of carbon emissions, and at the end of the year, if they have a surplus of units, or if they went under their limit, they can sell those units to other countries.
It's called emissions trade.
Yeah, exactly. That's really the only international economic incentive that I've heard of. Could it be that there aren't? Could one of the reasons that it's not front page news be that there aren't as many publicly advertised economic incentives like that?
No. Privilege is the reason. We're too comfortable. It's not hitting us. Yeah.
I guess that I'm thinking about his question, and my question is, well, how do you develop the concept of enough? And even going further than that, how do you implement the concept of enough in the global north?
In the global north. Well, that's why some people are practicing the first world, third world, like the Minnesota Pachamama Alliance, doing these workshops to get people connected. And then, you know, it involves some ecotourism of getting people to go there and spend time listening. And, but, you know, it's debated, why don't you listen to the indigenous people in your own land? They've been so colonized and so exhausted that the few leaders who are still able to flourish on their own colonized land takes a lot. You know, how many times can we ask Winona LaDuke to keep coming back, or Tom Goldtooth? I mean, yes, they're right there. They're in our backyard. They're coming to our protest a week from today. We have an Enbridge pipeline across northern Minnesota, tar sands pipeline, and they're gonna ship it on the Great Lakes. Ever heard of like shipping accidents on the Great Lakes? Yeah. So we have yet another hearing, and we're going to hear the Indigenous Environmental Network work with us. But I mean, they're overworked people, you know, your local people of color, your local indigenous people who are trying to be everything to everybody, just like so many people are. So yeah, culture change. Connect. Feeling connected. Connecting to community, creating opportunities for people to come to community. That's why this queer food for love, what that does is it says we all have the greatest power to organize the communities that we're a member of, whatever they are. That's where you have the greatest standing, not going out in someone else's community, but your own community, and creating like roving food potlucks or things that connect people so that it meets that really deep need for connection, for community. And that does a lot. And that's that transition town thing. I think we're done.
Okay, great.